Hello everybody, welcome to this instruction video. In this video I'll be showing you all the bits that are involved with making the peekaboo button wrap by Miss Neriss. Now, the original design you can find on her blog, missneriss.com, and we're making the peekaboo button wrap. So what I'll be doing is I'll be showing you all the ingredients that are involved in making this wrap. I'll not be taking you step by step through the entire process. For that you will need her blog and her pattern. But I will show you how to make the stitch pattern, how to make sleeves or buttonholes, and I'll show you how to start and how to make sure that you don't accidentally get mixed up in the stitch pattern somewhere. The yarn that I used to make my button wrap is from Scheepjes. I used Bloom in a beautiful chocolate color, and the original design uses Stonewashed XL, which is also a very nice yarn. Now, the basic difference between these two is that the Bloom is much lighter than the Stonewashed XL, but they both worked with a 5mm crochet hook. So I'm using this one for my own wrap, and this uses the pattern, but for the video I'll actually be using a different yarn altogether. I'll be using a much lighter yarn, because if I was to use the chocolate colored yarn you wouldn't really be able to see what I'm doing, and that would of course be a pity. So I'll be taking you step by step through the process. I hope it's a useful video for you. Thank you for watching. Something that I suggest that you do before you really start making your complete wrap is to check your gauge and how your yarn and hook size combined gives you which dimensions on the stitch pattern. I checked both a 5mm and a 4.5mm hook because I do tend to crochet a bit loose, so I wasn't sure which one of these would work best with this specific design. You see, the first few rows here I worked with the 5mm hook, and then these rows here I worked with the 4.5. And I was measuring this, and actually the 5mm hook worked better for me because these gave me the dimensions and number of stitches that was correct for the pattern, whereas this one was just slightly too small. But if you're, for example, a tight crocheter, you might even want to go up a hook size to, for example, a 5.5 to get the right dimensions. So do take the time to do this. I know the first thing you want to do is just start the pattern and start working on your design, but at the end of the day, taking the time for this will make sure that your garment fits at the end of the day, which is after all the whole point. So take a moment to just make a small test piece and check if your hook size gives you the right dimensions for the pattern before actually continuing on your complete garment. I have a slip knot on my hook, and I'm going to start by chaining 29 stitches. The pattern calls for 119, but you'll also get the point if I use less. Chain 29, and I'm going to chain these reasonably loose. If you're a tight crocheter, you might want to consider going up a hook size for this first series of chain stitches. So I'm going to make 29 chain stitches. It's 28 and 29. Now I have 29 chain stitches here. I'm going to work half double crochets starting in the third chain from the hook. So that's 1, 2, 3. So basically you're going to skip the first 2 chain stitches and then start working a half double crochet in each and every stitch until you get back to the beginning. So I've skipped these first 2, you can see them, 1, 2, and then the third one working a half double crochet. And continuing, and I'm going to work a half double crochet in each and every chain stitch. And if you're making the full pattern, this will be 119, or actually should say 117, because the chain 2 is of course your first stitch. 3 more to go. I'm working these last 3 half double crochets, and that will bring my number of half double crochets here in this small example to 27. That's 2 less than the amount of chain stitches you made. So that's the one in that first chain stitch. What you now see is that I have 27 full half double crochets and a chain 2 at the end. So that's how, so your number of stitches you have here is your chain length minus 2. Chain 2, 1, 2, and turn your work. And now we're ready to really start working the pattern. So to work the pattern, we're going to make half double crochets in respectively the front loop or back loop of each and every stitch. So we're going to start with a half double crochet in the back loop. So the next stitch you're going to be working in is immediately this stitch here. So in that first stitch, pick up the back loop and work a half double crochet. Then pick up in the front loop of the next stitch and work a half double crochet. And again in the back loop. And you're going to continue like this, alternating front loop, back loop, front loop, back loop. So you're working half double crochets. But always make sure that you're working them alternatingly. And for the next round, I'm also going to show you a little help that I made for myself to make sure that I don't accidentally forget whether I'm to work in the front loop or the back loop on your to and fro rows. You can see how I'm continuously working the front loop and then the back loop. So I'm going to make a jump in the video and work this entire row. You can see how a small pattern is already emerging here. Almost to the end, just worked a back loop, front loop in that stitch. So now I'm going to work a back loop in the next, and then a front loop again, and on the last full stitch, it's that stitch here, you work a back loop. So this is the last stitch. You work a half double crochet in the back loop, and now what's important is do not forget your turn. So that's the chain 2 that you made here. Also work on that stitch. Actually, that's actually inside the chain, the second chain. You also work a half double crochet. Because if you forget working on that chain stitch, everything's going to turn all skew at a certain point. Chain 2 and turn your work once more. And now I'd just like to show you a little trick to how to make sure that you don't accidentally work your pattern in the wrong way. What you see here is a scheme that I've made for myself to help me remember when should I work back loops or when should I work front loops. What I'm going to do is at the beginning of this edge here, I'm going to insert 3 stitch markers. Those are the 3 V's that you see here. These are stitch markers, so that I know when I'm working in this direction, so in the direction of the arrow, and my stitch markers are on the right, I know the first stitch I'm working in should be a back loop stitch. Then after 8 stitches, I'm going to place a stitch marker, and that needs to be a front loop stitch. Then 10 stitches later, again a stitch marker, and that should also be a front loop stitch. Then towards the end, there should be 9 stitches left before I get to the end. So that's going to be this point here. And these 9 stitches will also help you to see that you don't miss that last stitch in the turn, for example. Likewise, if my work is the other way around and I have the stitch markers on this side, so on this side, okay, I'm still working from right to left, but now my first stitch is a front loop stitch. Then I have 10 stitches before I get to the back, to a stitch marker, which should contain a back loop stitch. Then again 10 stitches and a stitch marker, which again should be a back loop, and then I should have 7 stitches left before I get to the end. So this way I have checkpoints every 10 stitches that I know, okay, this should be a back loop or it should be a front loop stitch. Now I have this scheme with me continuously while I've been making my wrap, and this has saved me from many mistakes, because every 10 stitches you automatically have a checkpoint, so that if you make a mistake you at most have 10 stitches incorrect, because it's very easy to accidentally start with a front loop where you should have started with a back loop, or the other way around. And then you work an entire row incorrectly, and that's going to mix up your entire stitch pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by placing stitch markers. So I have regular stitch markers, and I'm going to place them in the on one side, and then I'm going to start on this side here, so that is every 10 stitches, and then I have 3 stitch markers on the other side. So looking at my work here, I'm going to hook up 3 stitch markers on this edge. This is in the chain 2 space right at the beginning. I'm going to hook up 3 stitch markers. Now you could say this is an overkill. Why 3? Why not only just 1? I'm purely using 3 here so that I'm absolutely certain that this is the point that I'm referring to. And you could also do 2 here, but well, call me paranoid, but now I'm really absolutely dead sure which side is which. So one side now contains 3 stitch markers, and now I'm going to mark stitches and counting them back, and basically mark them every 10 stitches. Now it's slightly easier if we work from this side, so I'm just going to turn it around, because then you can count every 10 stitches. I'm going to open up my loop, and because now you count your full stitches. You see here, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then this here is stitch number 10. I'm going to hook a stitch marker in there, and then again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that is stitch number 10 again, so again hooking up a stitch marker. And now, in theory, if my scheme's correct, I should have 7 stitches left. So check, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches left. So that's correct. See, this here is hooked up in that chain 2, because a chain 2 as such does not count as a stitch. You always have an X number of stitches plus that chain 2. So this is correct. Now I'm ready to start working my first real round of the pattern. And I'm going to pick up my loop, which is over here. And I already have the chain 2 turn. So how to use the scheme? I see my 3 stitch markers are on this side, so that means I'm over here. So this is my starting point. My first stitch should be a front loop stitch. That's correct. Remember that the last stitch we worked here was a back loop stitch. So in the very first stitch, that's this stitch here, we're now going to work a front loop half double crochet. So on that very first stitch, work a front loop and then a back loop on the next. And this alternating pattern is really important. So the stitch where you worked a front loop in the previous round, you're working a back loop in the next round. And you're doing this to get a very nice stitch pattern. So So, oh wait, yeah, there we go. And a front loop. And a back loop. And just going to move this up a bit. You can still see it. Then a front loop. And a back loop. And then a front loop again. And now this is the point where we get to the stitch marker. And now it says the stitch marker should be a back loop stitch. Now just check, is the stitch marker? We just worked a front loop stitch, so yes, indeed, we now work a back loop stitch. So I remove the stitch marker, work a back loop stitch, back loop half double crochet, and then I'm going to reconnect the stitch marker to the stitch that I just worked, because this same stitch I'm going to have as a checkpoint when I come back the other way, because then that should be a front loop stitch. And now I continue the back loop, so the next stitch is again a front loop, and then a back loop, and again a front loop. And yes, there it is, back loop. And front loop, back loop. So lovely rhythm in this pattern. Front loop, you're only working half double crochets, back loop, front loop, and now I'm at the stitch marker again. Check, stitch marker should be a back loop. So I'm going to work a back loop, half double crochet, which is also the next stitch that I should be making, and I'm going to hook up stitch marker like so. And now the pattern says 7 more stitches. Just worked a back loop, so now I'm going to work a front loop. Front and back and front loop. Yeah, there it is. Front loop and back loop, front loop and back loop and a front loop. And now check how many stitches do you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's correct. Chain 2 and turn. And now we're on this side of the pattern again, because now our 3 stitch markers are here. So the first stitch we're going to be working is again a back loop stitch. On that very first stitch, pick up back loop. So my yarn not twisted here. Back loop and there we go, front loop and back loop and front and back. also be sure that you realize where your stitches are. Front and back loop. And now I should be working a front loop in the V, in the position where the stitch marker is. And I just worked a back loop, and now I need to work a front loop, so that's correct. So that's another checkpoint there. So I'm going to remove the stitch marker, work a front loop, half double crochet in the next, and then add the stitch marker again to the stitch that I just worked, like so. So by using this pattern, you never make more than 10 stitches at most a mistake, so you can catch things early. So this has really been invaluable to me whilst making my my project. So just also when you're starting halfway, it's easy to check. I've got the stitch markers on this side. My last stitch work contains a stitch marker that was a front loop stitch, so now I should be starting with a back loop stitch. So also when you're halfway and for whatever reason you had to stop, you can easily pick up where you are. Also a note on your stitches. Remember you're turning your work, and you might think that this is your stitch here, that this row, but actually it's not. This loop you see here is actually part of the third loop. If you turn your work slightly here, these are your stitches that you're working in, and not these. So do always take care that you're working in the correct loop, basically. So you need one of these two loops and not one of these two. See? So I'm going to start, pick up where I left off. Just worked a front loop stitch. Now I'm going to work a back loop stitch. So a back loop, and then a front loop again. And I'm of course working this on only 29 stitches, but the concept is exactly the same whether you're using 29 or 119. The concept is the same, and the only difference is the amount of times you're going to have a stitch marker. Because I choose to have it every 10 stitches, and you might say, okay, that's an overkill, but this way I really do catch mistakes early. Because if you don't have the stitch marker there, and you do accidentally make a mistake, your entire stitch pattern is going to go all crazy. So, and then a back loop stitch, and now I'm at the stitch marker position again, which I just worked the back loop, so that should be a front loop stitch I'm going to work now. And I can just check my chart, say, oh yes, that's correct, it should be a front loop stitch. So then that's a checkpoint, a reassurance for me that I'm still on track and not making any mistakes. So remove the stitch marker, work that front loop stitch, and then reconnect, there we go, reconnect the stitch marker. And you do actually get the hang of this quite easily. And just worked a front loop stitch, so now I'm going to work a back loop again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, and then this is number 6, and there we go, 7, yes, 8, and at this point you might think, oh, I'm done, I've worked all my stitches, but you should still work that chain 2 here, because remember also here it says you have 9 stitches until the end. So, and I've now only worked 8, so that's also a check that you don't accidentally forget the chain 2, that you also should work a stitch on there. So that was a front loop. Now, as such, you should work a back loop, but if you just work in that chain 2, it's usually going to be okay. You just pick up a loop and work a half double crochet. And that is the first part of your stitch pattern worked, and you can already see the pattern starting to form here, and also on the other side you can see it starting to form. And you only see the pattern basically every second round, because you need both the to and fro round to get the pattern visible. So chain 2 and turn, 1, 2, turn. And now again, I've got the stitch markers on this side. So if I check my pattern, okay, right, stitch markers are on this side. I should start with a front loop in the first stitch. Over, and in the first stitch, work a front loop. And then a back loop. And now you can really see how the rhythm in this pattern works, because I'm now exactly at the point where I was 2 rows ago. And this you're going to keep on repeating until you have a length that's long enough to that you say, okay, now I need a sleeve. And also on the pattern it's exactly stated how long that should be for each size of the garment, because if you're making a small, medium or large or extra large, really it does depend on how much fabric you need before you need a hole for your arm to go through. So that's a front loop I'm working there. And now my next stitch is a back loop stitch. So just check my chart. Back loop, yes, that's correct. So work a back loop stitch. There we go. Back loop. And reconnect the stitch marker. And continue. You continue like this, so you're working again all these stitches. Your checkpoint is your next stitch marker, which should again be a back loop stitch, and then you need to work 7 stitches. See here, 7 stitches before you get to the side to the end that has the 3 stitch markers again. So this way I'm continuously using this chart to help me make mistakes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work to the end, then I'm going to work 1 row back again, and then I have a nice little piece of fabric, and then I can show you how to make an armhole. Because this pattern that I just showed you, the to and the fro, you're going to continue doing that until you have enough space, enough fabric to make an armhole. So say at a certain point you've worked enough fabric and you want to work a sleeve. To show you how to do that. You start always the pattern with an X number of stitches. Checking again where my stitch markers are. I know the first stitch I need to work is a back loop stitch. And then I'm going to work a certain number of stitches until you're at the point where you need to work either a sleeve or a buttonhole. The concept is the same, just the number of stitches is different. For the sleeve, the pattern asks for 20 stitches, but and for the buttonhole, that is of course a lot more. So I'm going to continue until I'm past the first stitch marker, and then I'll show you how to work. Let me just call it a hole, whether it's for the sleeve or for the button. And now I'm again at my checkpoint, working in the stitch marker, and then I know, okay, this should be a front loop stitch because my stitch marker is on this side, and if I check my graph, I see, oh, yes, correct, front loop stitch. So I always have that graph with me when I'm working this design. There we go. And then move the stitch marker to the current position, so it's going up 1 level. So let's say you need to work 11 stitches, let's say. So I've already worked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The stitch marker here is in position number 8. 8. And this is 9, 10, and 11. And also remember that the chain 2 itself doesn't count as a stitch. So I now have worked 11 complete stitches. And let's say I need to make a space that is 5 stitches. I'm going to chain 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And skip 5 stitches here to the bottom. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the next stitch I need to work in is this one here. And now it's also great because you have the stitch marker here. And okay, the stitch marker should be a front loop stitch. Remember, if we go back to the graph, it should be a front loop stitch. And okay, then I'm working in the stitch just before, then that should be a back loop stitch. And this way you can also guarantee that you're still working in the rhythm of the pattern and not accidentally going from alternating to, for example, to being in sync, and then your pattern, your design will be different. And then a front loop stitch on where the stitch marker is. I'm going to bring that stitch marker one up. Like so, and continue the pattern basically. So I'm working a back loop and a front loop again, and what you've now done is you've created a space for which we're going to be working into on the next round, or the next row I should say, when we go back the other way. Need to work these last few stitches. Need 9 stitches here on this side. See, how many do I have now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I need 2 more. This is a front loop stitch, and then that last one is a back loop on the chain 2. If you want to work into that chain 2, a back loop, chain 2 again, and turn. And you can see here that you now have this space. So now we're going to work back, and in the process also fill up or work in the chain space, and hence create a nice clear little hole for example a button in this case. So the first part of this pattern of the row, you're going to work exactly according to pattern. So again, looking at where the stitch markers are on this side, I now, okay, I need to start with a front loop stitch. So you're going to continue to work until you're reaching a point where you know, okay, this is where the hole is. So just follow the pattern. I'm just going to follow the pattern until I'm at this point here, and then I'll show you what to do here. So I'm still working the pattern, which means this here is a front loop, half double, and then I still need to make a back loop in the stitch that contains the stitch marker. And that is correct according to my drawing. So, and I move the stitch marker 1 position upwards, so to the row currently making. And now I also see that the next stitch is already immediately the chain stitch. Now you work 5 half double crochets in this chain stitch because you've made a chain 5, so you're going to do 5 here. If you made a chain 7, you work 7. If you made a chain 30, you work 30. You work the same amount of half double crochets as the length of this chain stitch here, these chain stitches. I am not going to be making them like this through the chain space. I'm actually going to be making them in the chain stitches themselves, because that way I get a nice edge like I have on this side here. So I want an edge like that. So I'm going to do 5 chain stitches, and especially this very first one, that's this chain here, do not accidentally skip this very first one, because it's very easy to skip that one. And this is just after the stitch worked in is this little stitch here. So I'm going to go into the loop of the chain stitch itself, if I can find it. And this first one might just be a little bit tricky, as you see. There we go. So that's 1 half double, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I've worked 5 half doubles because I have a chain space of 5. If you have a chain space of 7, you work 7, and if you have 30, you work 30. So same number of half double crochets as you have chain stitches. Now we're ready to continue with the pattern, and at this point it's also important to continue in the right order. So if the stitch in the round before was in a back loop, now you need to do a front loop, and vice versa. I'm going to actually use the stitch marker to count back, because if I look at my scheme, this stitch here, here's the stitch marker, so that's there. This stitch needs to be in a back loop, so I know this has to be a back loop stitch. So then I can count backwards. Back, front, back, front, back. So this first stitch here, that's this one, should be in a back loop. And that way I can ensure that I'm on the stitch pattern. So in the back loop of that first stitch, and also again it's easy to accidentally skip this first stitch. Front or back loop, and then I do a front loop in the next stitch, and then a back loop again, followed by a front loop, and now I'm at the stitch marker again, which in theory for this direction should be a back loop, and it is a back loop. So that means I'm still on the stitch pattern and everything is still correct. So I'm moving the stitch marker one position up. Also, one thing to do here is to just count your stitches. Now I have 10 stitches from stitch marker to stitch marker. So let me just double check that I still have those 10 stitches. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is 9, and 10 is the stitch is in this position, in the stitch mark position. So these are 10 stitches, so that's correct, because it's easy to accidentally skip a stitch here somewhere, either before or at the end of the chain space or at the beginning of the chain space. So this way I know I still have the correct number of stitches, and I've checked that I'm still on the right pattern, because this stitch needed to be a back loop according to my drawing. So that is correct also. And now I can continue with the rest of the pattern as though nothing is the matter. So that was a back loop, and then I do a front loop again, front and back, and I need to do 7 stitches here, front, back, and I'm having trouble seeing it. Yes, there it is. Front loop, back loop. Let me just count my stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches. So I still need to do one more, and that is again here on the chain 2. So I'm going to pick up a loop on that second chain stitch and work that half double. Chain 2 and turn. 1, 2 and turn. You can see how you've now made a beautiful little hole, in this case really nice and good for a button. Of course the button for this pattern needs to be even a bit bigger, so you'll be making a slightly bigger hole, but you got the concept here. And now I'm ready to start working a regular round as though nothing's the matter. Check where my stitch markers are. They're on this side, so I'm starting my first stitch in a back loop. Stitch marker position is a front loop, and even though you're going to be here work on half double crochets, you're going to continue in the pattern front loop, back, front, back, front, back, front, back, front, back, as though nothing happened here. So, and then you have all the ingredients you need to be able to make this peekaboo button wrap. What I've shown you is I've shown you how to make your base round with the half double crochets, how to make the first round of stitches, so work alternatingly back loop, front loop, back, front, back, front, back. I've showed you how to use a series of stitch markers to know whether you need to start on the back loop or the front loop, and how to ensure that you stay in the stitch pattern to really get this intricate design you see here with the alternating loops. I've also shown you how to make a chain space, skip an X amount of stitches, and then continue to work in the pattern. And when you go back, I've shown you how to work in the first row immediately above a space. So now you've seen all the ingredients you need to make this button wrap. You need to alternatingly work stitches, and at a certain point you need to make a number 3 in total spaces in this wrap. So follow the pattern so that you know exactly how wide it needs to be and how long in both directions before making holes at certain points in the pattern. That brings us to the end of this instruction video. I hope it was a useful video for you and that you'll be able to make this design yourself and also recreate this beautiful stitch pattern. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.